Hi, this is Daniel Karapkin speaking to you from Thornhill, Ontario in Canada. We are studying Moreh Nevuchim, Maimonides' Guide for the Perplexed. And we are in the middle of, or we just really started, chapter 10 of the second section of Moreh Nevuchim. I apologize for being a few minutes late uh, because of the davening schedule today, where it's still a statutory holiday in Canada. So we're going to get started right away. We are using the Shlomo Pines edition of the Hebrew translation of Moreh Nevuchim. And we are on page 270 in the middle of chapter 10. Just to get our bearings of where we were, we had done chapter 9 last week and we had begun chapter 10. And chapter 9 was the Rambam's devotion to trying to fit a cosmological model of the Ptolemaic planetary system into the number 4. Because as we mentioned last week, the whole story of Ma'aseh Merkavah, the act of the chariot as depicted in the book of Ezekiel and the book of Zechariah and a few other places, describes God's chariot as having 4 facets, 4 aspects to it of angelic beings surrounding the chariot. The Rambam's thesis is that the celestial bodies and the spheres which contain these celestial bodies are themselves these angelic beings that are described. And therefore, if there is a pattern of 4 that is presented by Scripture, we need to find that pattern of 4 contained within our astronomical reality. If we look up in space, we would expect to see a pattern of 4, just as is described in the book of Ezekiel in the chariot of God. And it's on that basis that the Rambam sort of takes sides with a medieval debate in astronomy as to where you are supposed to position certain planets. But he ends up grouping 4 different kinds of spheres, celestial spheres, which serve 4 different purposes. And that's where we are. Now, what we're going to essentially see in this chapter, as we continue through chapter 10, is that the Rambam presents us what he sees as several patterns of 4. He lists 4 patterns of 4 that he can find cosmologically in the universe. And the first one, therefore, that he presented, that he really started in chapter 9, was this, that there are 4 globes. And as we saw in the article by Gad Freudenthal last week, we have to, the Rambam uses different Arabic words for a sphere versus a globe. A sphere is one celestial, almost we could say one-dimensional, I should say really two-dimensional flat sphere that contains planetary bodies embedded within it. And a globe is 3-dimensional in that it has a certain width or birth to it that contains multiple spheres or groups of spheres. And so the Rambam says there are 4 celestial globes surrounding our planet. And of course, if you're just tuning in for the first time, we don't expect you to appreciate the fact that the Rambam is working with medieval astronomy that is no longer accepted as science. But we're going along with his project, which is to try and reconcile what he finds in Scripture with what science dictates to him as reality in his world, because that's really the Rambam's project. So I'm going to share my screen with you now so that you have an idea of what I'm talking about. And so we see over here that the Rambam says that there are 4 globes. If you recall, the outermost sphere, the Rambam said, is not part of the system that I'm describing, because the outermost sphere that is closest to God does not have any celestial bodies embedded within it. So that's not considered to be part of the Godhead described in Ma'aseh Merkavah. But the 4 globes that are being described is the globe of the fixed stars, which contains multiple spheres of different rotations of different stars. The second one is the globe of the 5 planets, namely Venus, Mercury, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, because they're all grouped together. That's what the Rambam had established in the previous chapter. Then you have beneath that the globe of the sun, and beneath that the globe of the moon. That's the way the Rambam wanted to arrange this pattern, specifically in order to reconcile Scripture with what modern science tells us. The Rambam had also told us that whenever we find the word mazal in scripture, in Talmudic literature, the word mazel or mazal refers to an angel, but specifically a celestial angel, which is part of this astronomical model. And therefore, because the Rambam very much is a subscriber to the medieval belief that the planetary stars, the stellar positions, directly influence everything that is happening in the physical world that we find ourselves in. When our sages talk about that the mazalot, that the stars influence what goes on in this world, dictating to every blade of grass to grow, is what we saw in the Talmudic quote from last week, which we're going to come back to this week. The Rambam understands that as being an ancient depiction of what science of his time, Aristotelian science, says is going on, which is that there is some kind of influence, a spillover of divine emanation that goes through these planetary bodies and influences all the movements and the motions and the combinations of elements that take place in our world. Okay, and we're going to elaborate on that as well. So the other three patterns of four that the Rambam makes connection to in our chapter, really starting on page 270. The philosophers have likewise mentioned. So we're not going to read everything inside in this paragraph, but the Rambam basically says that if you look at the four globes that I've just described previously, each one of these celestial globes can be linked to one of the four basic elements that were identified by Empedocles in the ancient Greek world as being the four elements whose combinations make up all compound elements that we find in our world today. They are water, fire, air, and earth. So going from the innermost sphere to the globe or to the outermost globe, the moon is directly related to water. And the Rambam says that scientists of his time have already noticed this, that the movement of the moon affects the tides, affects the motion of waters in the large bodies of water. So therefore, the moon has a direct influence on the element of water. The sun has a direct influence on the element of fire. Now, this is not because the Rambam believed that the sun is responsible for heat. In the Rambam's world, there was not necessarily a correlation between the light of the sun and the heat of the sun, but there was a belief that the sun was responsible in some way of emanating an element of heat or a fire, and that was what brought heat to the world. So the sun is directly responsible for fire. The planet globe, which contains the 5 planets, is responsible for air. And the Rambam really doesn't explain why or how that is. He just says towards the bottom of page 270, it is because of the multiplicity of the motions of these planets, their differences, their retrogressions, their direct progressions, and their stations, that the shapes of the air, its differences, and its rapid contractions and expansions are multiple. I guess by virtue of the fact that there's constantly changing orbits of the different planets within that globe, that causes movement, and that movement influences the element of air. And finally, the outermost of the 4 globes, what we would call the fixed star globe, affects the element of earth. And as the Rambam says on the top of page 271, perhaps the earth is so sluggish in moving to receive the action being brought to bear upon it, and in undergoing combinations because of the slowness of the fixed stars in their motion. So because the Rambam and modern astronomy of his time notes the slow movement of the stars, this is why it's associated with the most sluggish of elements, which is the element of the earth. So that's the second pattern of 4 that the Rambam finds here, directly linking the 4 pattern that is in the heavens to the 4 pattern which is in this earth. And then the Rambam reviews what he had already told us in chapter 72 of the first section, that there are four forces that proceed from the spheres. And these four forces are noted by other Jewish philosophers as well. The force that necessitates mixture and composition, engendering minerals. The force that provides a vegetal soul, engendering plants. The force that provides an animal soul, engendering animals. And the force that provides rational faculty, engendering humans. And the Rambam says that these are also the product of the four globes that are in the heavens. And although he doesn't directly link each one of these forces to any particular one globe, but the point that the Rambam is making is that once again we see a pattern of four, an emanation of four different forces that are necessary in order to deal with and sort of maintain the different kinds of creations that exist in the physical world. And finally, the last pattern of four that the Rambam makes note of in this chapter is the causes of motion within the spheres. The Rambam had spent a significant amount of time in chapter 4 dealing with what causes the spheres to be in motion. And the Rambam had concluded that the spheres are sentient beings which also possess will, a desire for them to constantly be in motion. So the first thing the Rambam says is that from a physics standpoint, you need to have spherical bodies which will allow them to go into circular orbits, because apparently if a body is not spherical, it'll be harder for it to go into it in a circular motion based on Aristotelian physics. So the first cause of motion within the spheres is the shape of the sphere, its sphericity or its roundness. The second is its soul, which causes it to move, because anything that moves must be animated according to what the Rambam had established in chapter 4 of our section. Number 3, it must have an intellect with which it cognizes and has awareness of the fact that it is in motion, but it has to have more than just sentience. It has to have a desire to move in order for it to move. And that is, the Rambam said, there has to be some object of that sphere's desire. What is the object of that sphere's desire? A separate intellect which is just above the sphere, to which the sphere aspires to either attain or to reach that level of that higher intellect. And that's what causes the sphere to move in pursuit of that higher goal. Before in chapter 4, the Rambam had just said that the sphere is aware of God, and that desire to emulate God, who is in motion, causes the sphere to be in motion. But here he seems to say that each sphere has its own intellect and an intellect just above it to which it aspires to move towards. And that's, he had alluded to this before. It's a bit nebulous as to exactly what that separate intellect is, but we'll just leave it at that these are the four causes that cause the sphere to move, cause a celestial sphere to move. But at this point, what the Rambam is doing repeatedly is just finding patterns of four throughout the universe, throughout the heavens, throughout the cosmos, and in the way that the cosmos interact with our world as well. And so that's what brings us to the bottom paragraph on page 271. And it's at this point that the Rambam makes an interesting observation, and he says, there are thus four I'm reading now from inside the text. There are thus four causes of the motion of the sphere and four sorts of general forces proceeding from it towards us. And this is actually what we had said before. But when we get to the very bottom, the very last sentence on page 271, he says, if you consider the activities of these forces, you will find that they are of two species. In other words, the forces that we discussed in number 3, the forces proceeding from the spheres that maintain and control minerals, plants, animals, and humans, like the four different levels the inanimate, plant life, animal life, and human life. Okay? Those are the forces emanating from the spheres, controlling and maintaining all that happens. And the Rambam says that these forces have two primary functions, or they are of two species, he says. For they cause either the generation of all that is generated or the preservation or maintenance of that which is generated. And for some reason, the Rambam goes into this sort of interlude to describe that there is a, what we would call philosophically a teleology, a structured sentient maintenance of all of creation, that nothing is arbitrary, but that you see through nature that everything is being maintained. And in this paragraph, he wants to emphasize the fact that that which we call nature ultimately is a system that is controlled by sentience, that is controlled by an understanding being who, through his emanations, overflows into our world, brings into existence new things, causes some things to pass away and to no longer exist, and maintains that which needs maintenance. So the two types of functions that the Rambam is referring to here is that that which we call nature brings things into existence and also maintains that. And the second thing is maintains things which are already in existence. And the Rambam sort of goes into this idea. He says, this is the meaning of nature, quote unquote, which is said to be wise, having governance, caring for the bringing into existence of animals by means of an art similar to that of a craftsman, and also caring for their preservation and permanence through the bringing into existence of formative forces, which are the cause of the existence of living beings, and nutritive forces, which are the cause of their lasting for whatever duration is possible. Okay, and this is all done by divine decree. It's very interesting that Rav Kafich, in his commentary to Moreh Nevuchim, points out to us that the Rambam was a big fan of ascribing sentience and wisdom to nature, and he does so actually in another sefer, a small sefer that he had composed that is not as well known, called Sefer Hanhagat HaBriut. The Rambam had written a sefer about health, about how to maintain one's health. And he said in this sefer, Va'omar ki kvar bi'ar lanu Gallianus, that Galen, who was a very, probably the most famous medieval physician in history, already explained to us, ki b'nei Yavan kulam bizman kadum kasher nistapek lahem choli, that all of the ancient Greeks, whenever they had an issue of not knowing how to treat a certain illness, lo asulo refuah badavar, they did not administer any kind of medical remedy, v'yanichu hachole im hateva, but they left the sick person up to nature. Kihu maspik birufuat hacholoyim, because nature itself has a tendency to heal illness. And he talks about Hippocrates talking about this idea as well, that he used to praise nature. V'chihu hateva chacham ve'arum ya'aseh mashera'ui, that he called nature wise and cunning, doing that which needs to be done. Ve'eno tzarich lezulato b'refuot hacholoyim, and nature does not require a lot of intervention by medicine in order to heal the patient. And the Rambam says this in the context of advising people that a physician should not intervene excessively, but should rather work with nature and allow nature to run its course in many kinds of situations. The Rambam is doing the same thing over here. He's basically explaining that when we look at nature, we see not only a system that works based on entropy and chaos, but to the contrary, we see a system that is extremely wise, is guided, and has structure to it. And so it applies to medicine as well. If you're not sure how to treat the patient, perhaps the best thing to do is to leave it to nature, which is in itself wise. And also when you're looking at divine providence and you're looking at, you want to be able to understand God's system of maintenance of all of creation, the best thing to do is to allow just to observe nature and see its wise teleology, its wise structure and guidance from the sentient God above. Please forgive me, but I'm not going to be taking questions right now, but feel free to email me at rabbi.koropkin@bayt.ca, and I'll be happy to answer all of the questions. I apologize, and the reason is because I have a very limited amount of time in which to make the presentation of this chapter, and we have a lot of material to get through. Thank you. Now, the Rambam, after having told us that he finds a pattern of four, and that this pattern of four is designed by God, and that's why nature is ascribed with wisdom, he then now, in the first paragraph on page 272, quotes from a midrash which corroborates this idea that there is a pattern of four throughout creation, and he links that to Jacob's dream of the ladder. Now, we don't have a copy of this in the Medrash Tanchuma, this midrash that the Rambam is quoting, but we do have an elaborate midrash quoted in what's called Midrash Hagadol. Now, it's important to note that Midrash Hagadol was composed in the medieval period, taking into account some of the writings of the medievalists who quote Midrash, and then incorporating their quotations into this text called Midrash Hagadol, the Great Midrash. And so therefore, it's not surprising that the sources of Midrash Hagadol, some of it may be from the Rambam itself, maybe from Rashi, maybe from other Rishonim, that perhaps they quote from the Midrash that they had access to, but that is no longer extant because it was lost over the sands of time. In any event, if we take a look at this Midrash, and it's really worthwhile for us to study the Midrash together, because of the constraints of time, I just want to start on the third line of this midrash. This midrash is referring to Jacob's dream in Parshat Vayetze, where it talks about V'hinei sulam mutzav arza v'rosho magia hashamayma, that there was in Jacob's vision a ladder that was firmly planted on the ground, but whose top, the head of the ladder, went all the way to the heavens. And the quote over here, Tana, Kama Rochbo Shel Sulam. The question that the Medrash undertakes, and this is the quote from the Rambam, what is the width of this ladder? How wide was it? We know that it was infinitely long, going from the earth all the way up to the heavens, that so far that it was no longer visible. But what was the width of the ladders? Shmonat alafim parsaot. Each rung was 8,000 parses wide. Now, dichtiv v'hinei malachei Elokim olim v'yordim bo. And the way we know this is because it says that there were angels of God. Angels implies two. That's the minimum of what the word angels mean in the plural. And you had a set of angels going up the ladder and a set of angels going down the ladder, which means that at any given time, says the Medrash, there were four angels that were side by side, two going up and two going down. And v'chipagi bahadadi, when these angels would intersect with each other so that they were all on the same rung at the same time, havelhu arba'a, there would be four angels next to each other, uchtiv be b'malach ugviato ketarshish, ugemiri to Tarshish trei alfe parse. The book of Daniel says, and we saw this, I think, a couple of chapters ago, that the book of Daniel states that each angel's width is 2,000 parses, because the Tarshish Ocean, which may be the Mediterranean, is 2,000 amot wide or long, and that's the width of each angel. And we therefore know that, and the Midrash says, the Kaimalon Kuli Alma Shita Alfe Parse, the whole world is 6,000 parses long in length, and Shlish Midbar, Shlish Yamim, Shlish Yishuv, the world is 1/3 desert, 1/3 oceans, and 1/3 inhabited area. This, of course, is an ancient belief. And Mikan Amru Malach Shlisho Shel Olam. And from here, the rabbis stated that the width of one angel is 1/3 of the width of, or the length of the world. Lefisha Kolma Shebara HaKadosh Baruch Hu ba'olamo nechalak lishlosha chalakim. For everything that God created in this world can be divided into three parts. Malachim tsura below goylem, v'galgalim golem v'tsura kvu'abo, lo titchalef v'lo tishtaneh ad olmei ad. Okay, so we see that we have one category of creations are the angels, which represent form without any matter. We have the Galgalim, which are the Golam Vitsura Kavuabo. We have the celestial bodies, which are both matter and form, but as the Rambam would say, it's a different type of matter than terrestrial matter, which is, and this type of matter is completely unchanging. The Yasod, and the third type of creature that God created in our world, hu nikra ofan golem v'tzura hu mitchalef hu mishtane b'chol rega v'rega ve'en lo tzura kevua ela mekabel hu l'chol tzura ve'hen arba'a yesodot eish v'ruach umayim v'aretz. It is what we would call terrestrial prime matter that can be broken down into the four basic elements. So therefore, we have these four angels. Each angel represents 1/3 the length of the world, which is 2,000 parses. If you put them four of those 2,000 parsa wide angels side by side, you get 8,000 parses. Shenayim olim ve'hein eish v'haruach, u'shnayim yordim ve'hein hamayim v'haaretz. And surprisingly, the Medrash connects each one of these four angels to one of the four elements. The two angels ascending the ladder represent fire and air, because those ascend, those are elements that are light and therefore go up. And the two angels that are descending represent water and earth, which are heavy and therefore go down. So the Medrash itself is creating a connection between the dream of Jacob of angels and a model, a scientific model of physics, exactly like the Rambam describes on page 272 in our chapter. V'hu baruch hu hamechaberet ha'ohel v'haya echad. And God is the one who brings everything under his tent and consolidates all of the different components of creation together. Shenemar v'hinei Hashem nitzav alav. And that's the image that Jacob has in his dream, that God is standing over this ladder. This ladder is representative of all of creation, okay? And the angels represent the different components of creation, the different forces within creation, exactly as the Rambam depicts. Mikan amru chachamim sulam shera'a Yaakov Avinu olam ushlish haya. And it is from here that our sages tell us that the width of the ladder was 1 1/3 lengths of the planet Earth, or of our world. Because if our world is 6,000 parses and Jacob's angels are 8,000 parses wide, because there's four of them side by side, this means that it's 1/3 longer in length in his dream than the length of the earth. I'm skipping the bracketed area because it doesn't really fit with the theme that we're discussing. And kama ma'alot hayu b'sulam, and how many rungs of the ladder were there, even though the ladder goes up to heaven. But the Midrash now depicts that there were really only 4 rungs of the ladder. Arba dichtiv olim v'yordim. Going up in the plural means that there were 2 rungs for going up, and an additional 2 rungs for going down, whatever that means. But essentially, there are 4 rungs in the ladder. V'chein hu omer. And then the Midrash connects this pattern of 4 with the story of the Ma'aseh Merkava, the vision of the chariot in Ezekiel chapter 1. V'chein hu omer ve'arba'a panim le'echat ve'arba kenafayim la'achat lahem, which describes again these 4 different angelic beings, each one with 4 different types of wings, and therefore the Medrash concludes kishem shahayesodot arba'a kach hagalgalim nechelakim la'arba'a. And just like there are 4 elements, so too are there 4 different types of celestial spheres or globes, like the Rambam described. V'chein hamalachim arba'a, and therefore there are 4 angels being depicted in Jacob's dream. V'chein kol hanivra mehen nechalak la'arba'a, and everything that emanates, which is a product of the celestial influences, this overflow from God, also is divided into four elements and four parts and four forces. V'chein hu omer, and so does it say in the book of Zechariah, Vayomer Elai Ela Arba Ruchot Hashamayim Yotzot Mehityasev Al Adon Kol Haaretz, that God spoke to me, the prophet Zechariah, and he said, these are the four winds of heaven which emanate from the place of standing of the master of all of the earth. That is the conclusion of the Midrash. Now, the Rambam tries to present to us what the meaning of this exactly is. He quotes this passage from Zechariah in chapter 6, and he then says on page 273, they are, he says, that the prophet Zechariah says that these four winds or these four airs that emanate from after presenting themselves before the Lord, they are accordingly the cause of everything that comes to pass in time. Now, the last part of our chapter is where the Rambam analyzes a particular statement where he says that as part of part of Zechariah's vision, he says, in my vision, what did I see? This is Zechariah chapter 6, verse 1. V'hinei arba markavot yotzaot mibein shnei heharim. I noticed that there are four chariots coming from between two mountains. Veheharim harei nechoshet. And these mountains were mountains of copper. And so, or brass, he says, but really it's copper. So, and the prophet basically says these four chariots represent four types of airs or four types of wind that emanate from God, the forces that are responsible for all of creation. The question, of course, is what does it mean that Zechariah has a vision of mountains of copper? In regard to his mentioning copper and likewise the dictum burnished copper, which is a reference to Ezekiel chapter 1, verse 7, where he sees that the angels have feet that are like copper that is creating sparks. Why is copper used? He says, perceive, and likewise the dictum burnished copper, perceive in them a certain equivocality. You will hear an indication regarding this, meaning that the Rambam is saying, I will discuss this in later chapters. I'll discuss it in chapter 29, coming up in section 2, and I will discuss it in chapter 43. In both of those chapters, however, unfortunately, the Rambam is not explicit to explain what copper means. And so if we look at the commentary of Shem Tov on our chapter, he explains that the word copper means that they are durable and unchanging. And the mountains that are described in this passage are this prime matter, which is responsible for that is sort of the primary emanation from the heavens that gives rise to the four elements. And that's what the Medrash meant when it said that this prime matter is unchanging and unmoving and not subject to any kind of alteration or movement over the course of time. That's the transition from celestial matter and to the matter that we get into our world. And that's what the word copper means. It just means something that's hard and unchanging. As for their dictum that an angel is equal in breadth to a third of the world, namely their dictum in Bereshit Rabbah, which reads textually that the angel is the third part of the world, it is already very clear. The Rambam has explained it, and we've explained it in this chapter as well. For all created things are divided into three parts: the separate intellects, the bodies of the spheres, and the third first matter. This is also what we saw in Midrash Hagadol. Now, I'm going to conclude with reading the final paragraph of this chapter, where the Rambam states as follows: in this way will he who wants to understand the prophetic riddles understand them. In other words, what I have presented to you is an exegesis on how to understand Scripture. And the way you understand Scripture, and when it comes to these kinds of very esoteric visions of the heavens and what controls the earth through the heavens, understand that everything is explainable through Aristotelian science. And he will awaken from the sleep of and he who will awaken from the sleep of negligence be saved from the sea of ignorance and rise up toward the high ones. He, however, who is pleased to swim in the seas of his ignorance and comes down lower and lower, a reference to a verse in Deuteronomy chapter 28, has no need to weary his body and his heart. When he ceases moving, he goes down to what is lowest in nature. Understand all that has been mentioned and reflect upon it. And so the Rambam is basically reconciling scripture with Aristotelian science. That is his project in a nutshell. We may look back on this chapter and say he's found patterns of four in the universe where those patterns may not really exist based on modern science. But the project is itself a worthy project. If we find the Torah depicting something that has to do with the origins of our universe and how the world came to be, and we can reconcile it, let's say, with the Big Bang Theory, that's part of this same project that the Rambam is engaged in. If you look at the very beginning, for example, of the commentary of Ramban Nachmanides to the book of Genesis, you will notice that he does exactly the same thing in trying to explain how the world was chaos and void, tohu vavohu, representing this prime matter, what is what the Greeks called hule, and how God formed prime matter into various different compound elements, and broke everything and down into its constituent components. Right? That's the Ramban is engaging in the very same project as the Rambam to reconcile creation with modern science of his time. And therefore, our goal, if we wish to be Maimonidean or even Nachmanidean in our objectives of trying to make sense of the world around us in terms of scripture, that's our project as well. We may get it wrong, just like perhaps the Rambam got it wrong, but it's nevertheless a worthy project. Let me wish you a good day, everybody, and we'll see you soon. We'll continue, God willing, next time with chapter 11. Take care now.